Meanwhile, two things. Number one, I also specialize in horror games, so the examples come from horror games, nothing personal. And also, I'm going to stick to a script because I get distracted very easily, so if I'm not controlled, I tend to wildly divulge into weird digressions, so I'll just stick to what I had in mind initially. Okay, so digital games. So I think at this point to say that digital games rely on virtual environments, and one of the distinct defining characteristic of game texts is the way in which the players relate to those environments, i.e. of avatars, is kind of redundant in this room. But yeah, the majority of game avatars are avatars are very important, and the majority of avatars are represented as either human or humanoid characters, which is obviously a form compatible with the human body schema. And this is how this is related to the VR problem. The digital body schema, or the extended embodiment that has emerged in the process of playing regular digital games meant to be displayed on screen is now effortlessly comprehended and managed by the players. So the command of avatars as we know them has become natural and efficient. And the situation changes when the virtual environment, instead of being displayed on a screen, is adapted to or developed specifically for a virtual reality device such as Oculus Rift or HTC Vive or any other hardware that is either available or currently in development. And to some, the VR technology seems like not only a tremendous technological development, but more importantly, the natural next step in game text, in game development, in game design. However, flat, non-interactive screens have been the default display method, default display device for digital games for a very long time. And the new VR setting is not entirely compatible with this path of development, because a player using a VR device to view the virtual environment experiences this kind of patchwork combination of the pre-existing on-screen extended embodiment habits with the cues of the actual body schema of the player body in their physical space as they either sit or move around in the room. So while a VR setting might be applicable in specific game genres or specific in-game circumstances, as far as first-person perspective games, at least, are concerned, it is a decidedly problematic environment. And the first important issue of the VR gaming is that the substantial number of its immersive qualities, at least, again, as far as first-person games are concerned, VR obviously barely affects the fictional world, but it almost completely rewrites the concept of the virtual environment itself, when you think about it, because in conventional game text presented on screen, immersion was usually achieved by the combination of effort on the producer's part and the player's willingness and ability to perceive themselves as part of that environment. And basically, as Whitmer and Singer summarize it, immersion was a psychological state in which the player perceived themselves as enveloped by, included in, and interacting with the environment, which provided a continuous stream of stimuli and experiences. And the game strived to create an inclusive, extensive, surrounding, and vivid illusion of reality to the sense of a human participant, as phrased by Slater and Wilbur. Gordon Kalecha also argued that the term incorporation would provide for a better and actually more accurate metaphor, and he defined incorporation as the absorption of a virtual environment into consciousness, yielding a sense of habitation supported by the embodiment of the player in a single location that would be the avatar. However, due to obvious time limitation, I think the term immersion would do just fine, seeing as immersion in its essence is just the state of being thoroughly engaged in any given text, or even in Kalecha's own words, the shortening of the distance between the player and game environment, often yielding in a sensation of inhabiting the space represented on screen. And I think I might have missed a slide. No, I haven't. Wow. So no matter what we settle on, no matter whether we settle for Slater and Wilbur's definition of immersion as the psychological state of being in the virtual environment, or Kaleha's concept of incorporation as absorption of the virtual environment into consciousness, the issue here lies not with the immersive, but with the immersive aspects of VR. In contrast to immersive qualities, the immersive factors, as defined by Kubinski, would be all the elements that emphasize or bring out the superficial and artificial nature of the in-game world, uncovering the underlying structure of the game as software. So one of the immersive elements listed by Kubinski are, for example, McMahon's shocks. So the poorly designed elements such as being able to see where the environment ends, incomplete objects, polygon leaks, latency, or motion sickness. And Kubinski elaborates on shocks in terms of immersion, defining them further as elements which reveal the mediated character of the virtual environment of the game world and its dependence on electronic devices such as computer or gaming consoles with their elusive technical nature. And while immersive shocks tend to result from mistakes, they can, more importantly in terms of this paper, they can stem from imperfections arising from the nature of digital medium. So yeah. And with the above in mind, let's turn back to the crucial matter of the extended embodiment in games. An issue that is actually extremely important in the context of discussing both VR and non-VR virtual environments. The notions of embodiment, extended embodiment, and the body schema held by the player are all tied to the experience of playing a first-person game. Where was I? While the avatar represents the location of the player's embodiment in the game, the extended embodiment emerges between the body image and that the player has, the image that they link to the avatar, and the body schema that the player makes use of, i.e. The notion of owning the avatar's body and linking this image to the player and perception, the player's perception, and the notion of accepting the controllers as an extension of the player's body, through which the, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that if I turn my head, my voice disappears. The controls are used to perceive the game world, the virtual environment directly. So in this way, extended embodiment fuses the player's intentions, actions, and perception. Sorry. While the body image is subject to visual and sound representation of the game, both in terms of its capacity to be affected by environment, as for example being hurt or being attacked, as well as the capacity to affect that environment. So for example, if the avatar is thrown or if it falls into the water, the water would splash, and so on and so forth. And if you're wondering what you're looking at, and you're not looking at much here, unfortunately, because it's very dark, the idea here is that this is the scene from Resident Evil 7, where the avatar is, we all assume that Ethan is being stabbed in the face. That's what we assume. I think we never learn what happens, but basically, in non-VR gameplay, the players are usually affected strongly by this scene, and they involuntarily tense up, despite the fact that obviously they don't feel anything happening to them. So this is the idea of the body image. So the key important characteristic of controllers that we use to navigate in games is that we expect them to be reliable when they translate the player's intended actions into the environment of the game world. And those controllers tend to be very conventional. The mouse and keyboard, or any other controller at this point, actually become an extension of the player's body through which the game world is perceived directly. In the very same way like a white cane would work for blind people, so the tool ceases to be sensed as a separate object and is instead recognized just simply as an extension of the arm, which allows the handler to perceive the ground just directly. And the problem with VR does not lie in new controllers or new hardware, because we have new technologies emerging and they provide new interfaces, new means of interacting with them all the time. The problem lies actually in the intersection of the hardware issues, i.e. the controllers and therefore the body schema of the player, and the immersion issues, i.e. the immersive elements of the gameplay experience. So the strongest appeal of the VR interface is undoubtedly its visual aspect, right? The image is right in front of the player's eyes, eliminating most of the outside distractions and literally obscuring the non-game reality. And the players feel that wearing the headset, being fully immersed in the world and being to actually physically look around adds to the game. However, some of the strongest points of that very technology are simultaneously the origin of some problems with the VR interface that I'm going to mention. Because the seemingly increased immersion does not correspond with the physical, real-world aspect of gameplay as an experience. There are tremendous difficulties in constructing a viable body schema for the players in VR environment, which are related to relaying actions through controls and the world responses, as well as other immersive elements such as interactions with the virtual environment and the player's perception of actually inhabiting the world. So, the primary immersive aspect of the VR consists in translating the actual physical space which the player occupies to the virtual field of view displayed by that VR device. Whenever the player encounters blocked pathways or invisible walls or tries to interact with objects that are just not designed to be interacted with, this obstacle is more frustrating in a world that seems more real and therefore more accessible. So when a VR text attempts to place the player in the world of the game, but at the same time nothing in this world can actually affect them, the player, or even touch them, the player experiences an unsettling dissonance. So, for example, in first-person horror, an encounter with the basic material object of horror, a dead body, should be horrifying and revolting, since in VR environment, the corpse appears to be very close to the player, almost touching them. However, as a matter of fact, the abject nature of the corpse is, in this case, of no consequence, since it cannot actually interact with the avatar, it cannot breach the line between the other and the self, and it also, all the more, it cannot interact or affect the player in any way. So the same technology that brings the source of horror closer, at the same time separates it from the avatar, and it provides a sense of security, which is obviously, which counteracts the whole idea of the horror genre in this case, right? So this effect can be actually achieved, but it requires a very well thought through setup in which the avatar would be separated, let's say physically, from the object, and this can be actually seen, for example, in Narcosis. Now this is a non-VR gameplay because this is the point I'm making. So in Narcosis, when Virgil examines the drowned scientists who are right in front of him, he does so from the comfort of a half-a-ton atmospheric diving suit. So he's safe, if you think about it. So he can't be touched. And this corresponds to with the point of view of the player, who feels the regular gravity and the dry environment around them. Now, on the other hand, in Resident Evil 7, I like Resident Evil 7, it's just a good example. In Resident Evil 7, for example, when Ethan wades forward chest deep in murky, repulsive water, and suddenly a half-decayed corpse just bobs up to the surface, the avatar, Ethan, recoils instantly in horror and disgust on his own. But the player is actually, like in VR gameplay, the player would remain unaffected by either the water, the horrible smell, and the prospective touch of the repugnant thing, not to mention other Resident Evil 7 sequences into which I will not go now because time. So in non-VR gameplay, this is different, but in VR gameplay, there's just something that should be there is just not there. So the visual cue for danger coupled with the knowledge that the avatar is actually in no danger at all creates yet another kind of dissonance. And the players notice all those dissonant aspects of VR games. So basically they notice that many games put the player in the virtual environment without a body and actually considered immersion breaking to look down and not see the avatar's arms or legs in a VR game more than in a regular game. They are frustrated about not being able to interact with the environment, literally in front of their eyes, or even simply touch objects that the headset projects before their very eyes. And sometimes the inclusion of both physical movement and controllers to move around, so porting versus walking, or actually porting and walking, is also considered weird by some. And the very technology responsible for the safe immersion in room-scale VR, so the blue lines that come up and tell the player when they are about to step into something. So that technology is actually, in its nature, immersive when you think about it. And yes, no, yeah. And the second more distracting aspect, immersive aspect of VR stems from the natural limitations of the current stage of development of that technology. So there are currently insoluble problems in relying the responses of the avatar to the player's body to the screen. And this difficulty concerns both the active and the passive. So obviously it's not visible in the picture, but like when players phase through objects in VR, it's not good. So these difficulties concern active and passive aspects of relaying response. So when the player jumps or tries to hit an object, the avatar's movements do not reflect that action. And more importantly, again, in Resident Evil 7, for example, if the avatar is like hit or thrown or otherwise affected, if they were to faint or fall, there is no way of translating that state to the player playing the game. So in virtual environment, the intended action is completely translated into presence of the avatar, so the necessary information, like regarding a gesture or intended action, is calculated according to the schema of the avatar. And in this way, VR gameplay creates a peculiar dissonance where either everything in the player's body is extended into the game, apart from the neck and head, which are perceived just like in reality, and such is the case with seated VR, or the player must simultaneously keep track of the extended embodiment and the real body moving in their physical surrounding, such as it is in room-scale VR. Furthermore, seeing as tracking sensitivity of different VR devices may vary from title to title, sometimes very subtle or quite vehement movements on the player's part may not translate to accurate representation on what is happening on screen, or the range of representation might be very broad to begin with. And the players can detect this even when they play a game designed for VR on a regular screen. So sorry, more disembodied hands and this. So the players can sense that the game moves just slightly off compared to other first-person games, or that they feel that without the physical feedback loop, the kinesthetics of playing a game is lost, and they complain about feeling floaty and imprecise. And interestingly, for some players, the lack of physical feedback alone is just enough to doom VR games from a more hardcore gameplay perspective. And I think we talked about nausea. That's another immersive issue. So, and many players complain about the nausea. Some of them experience after like about 20 minutes of playing a VR game. So that's also a thing. The other essential problem, I know, only problems. I like VR, it's just. The other essential problem linked to the VR technology is the issue of its effect on game development. And the expected and perceived quality of game texts. So the flourishing indie scene actually, like indie game scene, makes it possible to observe how the employment of VR interface tends to lower the player's expectations towards new titles. So a weak and mediocre game designed for a VR device tends to be perceived as more entertaining and a better quality product experience than it would be as a regular game. And this tendency results in an overall lowering of the quality bar for the players' expectations towards VR titles. So the VR games can get away with poorer level design, weaker narrative design, and just very limited interactivity. So this is also an issue that does not escape the players, many of who actually notice that VR exclusive games do not compare to the existing conventional games and usually rely entirely on their novelty factor. The players' expectations are actually not unreasonable if you think about it. They do not demand that VR titles be better than conventional games, but they do believe that a good game experience means that a game is not only impressive in VR, but also solid outside of VR, which makes sense. Unfortunately, the players also point out that many VR games offer very limited replayability, and most VR games are actually short experiences that last less than an hour, or sometimes can be even like, less than 10 minutes. So this issue seems to, the issue seems to lie with the nature of the VR interface itself, which, according to some players, lends a sense of dimension and excitement over a mediocre text. And that dimension excitement makes the players, other players interested in texts that would otherwise go unnoticed if they were developed just simply as conventional games. And in this case, I like this, this argumentation saying that that's like saying a game is better with a snazzy new monitor and new controller. Initially, probably, yes, but as the user points out, once you get used to the monitor controller, the game is only as good as its gameplay. Now, obviously, even those players who dismiss the majority of VR games as weak text do not deny the effect VR has on the visual representation of the game and the game's world. When a mediocre game appears to be very entertaining, it can be attributed to the fact that it was in VR. The players admit that many of the first-person VR games do exactly what is necessary to achieve the desired result, that result being the player's engagement in and or at the virtual environment. But they also point out that once one actually is wearing the headset, far fewer stimuli are actually necessary to engage and impress the wearer of that headset. So even basic actions such as picking up objects or crouching are much more exciting in VR, which, as John Wolfe put it, gives life even to underwhelming games. So this is all the more significant when we take into consideration the fact that the players are well aware that some developers are taking advantage of this effect, and sometimes knowingly, the developers, not the players. Sometimes they knowingly choose to spend less time and effort in order to create a short experience that will rely on the VR for its appeal in comparison to the time, effort, and cost devoted to create the majority of AAA games, while simultaneously still raising the price of the VR product. And for those and few other reasons, many players agree that VR interface that does not necessarily make games better, but can in fact potentially render some titles worse due to the current limitations of VR technology, including image resolution and user comfort. Now, the VR technology might still very well be the next step in development of digital games. But right now, in the light of the hitherto ongoing evolution of game texts, it's ridden with many problems. Even poorly executed, i.e. very immersive VR game interface, still tends to artificially enhance the quality of the experience of playing a game that would otherwise appear as mediocre or weak to the players. However, with the help of VR technology, weaker games can, for example, provide temporary fun and entertainment and good time. And a case in point here could be Paranormal Activity: Lost Soul, which players tend to find entertaining despite the fact that it has numerous flaws, such as simplistic item collecting gameplay, occasional sequence breaking, and rather unclear plot. On the other hand, the high quality of a game can make the immersive aspect of high quality VR hardware and interface even more conspicuous. And the best example here would be, again, the aforementioned Resident Evil 7, where the lack of motor feedback in some situation, like, for example, even at the beginning of the game when Ethan is thrown by enemies or pulled up by them, those horrifying floating disembodied arms, which I think are frankly the most horrifying thing in the whole game, in VR gameplay. So those things just simply don't they don't harmonize with the overall quality of the rest of the game, such as the gameplay, the plot, the narrative framework, and the design, and everything. And this problem can be not as pronounced in other types of games, which overcome the limitations of VR and provide some space for realistic justification for the potentially immersive aspects of the interface. Again, going back to the aforementioned narcosis, where the avatar is stuck in the excessively heavy atmospheric diving suit, which would naturally reduce the motor feedback the avatar might otherwise be supposed to experience. And those two issues, the issue of immersive aspects and the issue of quality of the text, they are two separate problems, but it should be noted that they are linked. And subpar execution, where the player phases through walls and objects and fights the imprecise controls all the time, controls that prevent them from taking decisive and spontaneous actions. All of this results in a dissonance where the players feel that they are unable to properly interact with the world or even control their own presence in that world. And this dissonance, in turn, combined with the immersive aspect and confusing combination of real body control and, I'm sorry, body schema control, leads to subpar gameplay, which undermines the role of the VR technology as the next stage of game evolution at this moment. So, thank you.